We continue chapter 297, page 600, in Ayin Beis, volume 1. Let me sum up chapter 296, which is getting to become very interesting. And that is that because Ayin Keli, Ayin yesh, Keli being identity, let's call it itness, substance. Representing substanceless, a personality that is not about itself, but about its source. Because they're opposites, so the whole explanation in the previous discourse was they both need to weaken their personalities and exchange their functions. The assuming some of the Keli type of personality by going from the Ayin to yesh, from its state of lack of selflessness into a lack of itness and substance into the yesh, to manifest in the yesh, and the Keli has to do the same, be receptive to the higher bittul and the higher sense of purpose, the higher sense of divine awareness of the earth. So because that has to happen, now the combination, in other words, it's a process. This process requires a perfect formula, a formula that makes sure that the balance is appropriate and is sustainable. So what is the general requirements for this formula? Is that the earth should not be too much ayin, and also not too much yesh, and that the keli should not be too much ayin, too much yesh or too much ayin. In other words, they shouldn't go too far in their extending to the other, and shouldn't go too little. He said, "Le'poches v'le yigra." That's the general principle that's required, that it shouldn't be more, not less. And that they should be commensurate to each other. And I gave the example of the teacher and the student and so on, where there has to be the perfect balance and formula for them to meet. Now, in this he says there are four different possibilities that are four possibilities in dysfunctionality, where Ayin and Keli don't meet properly. Four possibilities. It appears to me that the first three are about the first level of what the preparatory stage. The first level is godless, when Ayin and Keli are not yet meeting, but are preparing to meet. What they have on their own, so to speak, the bittul that they have on their own. And the fourth problem, or the fourth element in the formula, is when they actually meet and they become give and take, and they receive from one another, which is where they become a union. So the first thing is in their preparatory stage. There can be three possibilities. That where it doesn't work. What's possibility one? That the keli is too much of a yesh, and therefore does not allow itself to be a fuel for the container. The example being fuel, a wick that is not combustible. That's not burnable. It doesn't burn. That would be anything that's not really fuel. So the keli never is not ready to contain this energy. So the energy is not affected here, but it will be affected because it'll expire. It won't be able to catch. The flame won't catch. Second problem is the opposite. The wick is too combustible. It's too weak, like paper or a fuel that burns out so quickly. So the keli is too much ayin. It doesn't have presence. So the flame will also expire because there's nothing to burn any longer. So here the keli has lost its identity. So in the first one, the keli is too much, too coarse. The second one is too non-coarse, so to speak. And so this is. Then comes the third one. This comes from the perspective of the energy. And we're not here discussing who's to blame, so to speak, because it takes two to tango. It's not so clear, but it's just let's put it this way: it's three states of dysfunctionality where you can describe, let's say, two people sitting with you and they're arguing. You can describe it this way: one of them is just not flexible and not ready to be receptive at all. Second problem could be it's too receptive and too submissive and enabling and not standing on its own, doesn't retain its voice. And problem number 3 is possible. The third possibility is where the container remains in its coarseness. And the contrary, it becomes very strong fuel because it's like what he said, like a moist log. It's thick and coarse. And the flame is compromised because the flame is burning and burning and burning without ever consuming the yesh. So the flame has become too much of the yesh. It's like trapped by the yesh now. It's almost like, I would say in the dysfunctionality in psychology, it's when a person becomes addicted, an enabler to a dysfunctional partner. So someone's unhealthy, let's say an addict, and the spouse is feeding them, is always being nice and is always taking abuse and just always satisfying the other person, and they become an enabler by giving the other person a sense of, I can keep doing this without consequences. I'm using an example. Obviously, that's not an eris and kelim of Atzilus or Tohu, but just an example. So here, the problem with number 3 is that is the other extreme of the energy. The energy is, he calls this the worst of all scenarios. That the energy is becoming too much of a yesh, and the keli remains a yesh gum. Then comes number 4. Number 4 is apparently, as I said, once they already joined. See, the first 3 is in their preparatory stage. Is it a wick or is it not a wick? Is it a container or is it not a container to that energy? So we're not even talking about giving and taking from each other. They can't even meet properly. Because either the fuel is burning out too quickly, or it is not a fuel, not a wick, not a proper wick, or it's not a wick because it's being consumed so quickly. And the third, of course, is also they don't have the ability to really properly meet, or they meet, but it's in a way that it's never going to take hold properly, because it's going to burn and burn, like you said. So the yesh remains a yesh gomer, and the air has now been trapped by the yesh, has become also coarse, and so on. The fourth option is once they meet, once they're receptive, now the bittul is no longer mitzad atzma. This is not their own sense of connection to each other. This is what each one gives to the other. So when they give to each other, there can also be a lack of balance. So now we have a new problem. We've gotten through the first one. It's a wick. Let's say it's appropriate wick. It can burn. It's not a non-combustible. It is appropriate wick and fuel. It won't burn out quickly. It won't trap the air in a continuous burning and never being sublimated. The yesh, the container. But now they've met. They're burning together. But here you can have a situation where they're not commensurate with each other. They're not balanced in their joining. And here there can be too much two possible ways within number 4 itself. One is that the air is too much yesh, more than it should be, commensurate to the containers being receptive, or the other way around, that the container is too much ayin and being too receptive, with the air not coming down as much as the keli is going up to the air. Now, in the example, let's see how that works in the wick and the fire, the flame. If it works in that example, they're actually burning. In the example, you're not really going to find the example because the physical example doesn't really have this option. Once they're burning, they're burning. That means, in a sense, if you have the 3 in the mushal, if you have the 3 working properly, number 4 will work properly. But in the nimshal, the way it is in the root, in the eris and kelim, in spiritually speaking, you can have that even there, though they're joined, but there's still a little too much of one or the other. In a way, number 4 is a replay of 1 and 2. The 2 options in number 4 are really like 1 and 2, but now on the level of the second escalos. In other words, because the 1 and 2 is also one is more ayin, one is more yesh. Somewhat, you could say it's similar to that, because in number 1, either the container remains too much yesh, okay. Not really, because the air is not not radiating that. The second one where it says that the container is no longer, the container is becomes too sublimated. That's where the container, that's like the second option in number 4, where the container is more sublimated to the energy than the energy is sublimated to the container. Okay.
You pointed out that there was a problem in that when the two times these things mixed together is that in the first scenario, the ore doesn't settle in. It does not say the shash. It's there, but it's not said the shash. In the second case of type number 4, so the ore doesn't illuminate the cloth. It doesn't
I don't remember that. There was such a distinction.
No, I thought there was. No, am I incorrect?
In both cases, if the container, the wick, is either non-combustible,
It says at the end.
Yeah.
In the body of the chapter.
What line?
Let's see. It's the third line from the bottom, not kind of the skin line, the 3-word line. And then the last line, he says, things or
okay, exactly.
Yeah.
In the two, this is the fourth. We're talking about the fourth flaw, the fourth possibility.
Yeah.
So there's two possibilities. One is im yesh bittul yesh la'ayin beis yesem fi hamshachim ayin yesh da shein ere mesihashiv bakili, right? That in other words, the container is being more sublimated than the air is, so the air does not settle into the container then, because the container is too porous.
Too porous.
It's become too sublime. That's not the purpose. That the container is not as much sublimated. It's too little sublimated. It remains too coarse. Which then will cause the air to be so the container is not bittul enough. Okay, yeah, because it has a similarity to option 3. If the keli is not bittul enough, and the teacher, let's say, wants to give, he's going to go down too low. It's going to become more yesh, and not going to really illuminate because the container is not receptive. It would be like a student who's not really receptive properly. The first option in this number 4 is the student is too receptive and loses themselves, and they don't really retain their, they become too porous, as we said. The second one is they're not receptive at all, or not receptive enough. They're less receptive than the air wants to give. The air is more ready than the keli is. So there, the air is going to become trapped in a way because it's in the mode of giving, and the keli is not really a container. So the air becomes more yesh. Therefore, that's what he's saying. That makes sense. Okay. So let's continue now. Reish Tzadik Zayin. I'm sure this will get clearer as he applies it now. I mean, what you can do with this 4 options is tremendous stuff. You can create a real model of mediation, of counseling, of people's problems, to identify an issue. Just this alone to show people that what the possibilities, and to zero in and isolate what is the real issue is tremendous, because it will then you can suggest interventions based on where's the problem here in the communication. And really, you have this functionality in all possible levels. So it can be analyzed, and this needs to be applied. We will definitely work on that. Chapter 297. So Reish Tzadik Zayin goes like this. We'll understand all of this on the level of Tohu, because remember, Tohu and Tikkun, if you recall, Tohu suffers from these 2 flaws. Both elements of Iskalus are not appropriate there. They don't tolerate each other, and they don't give and take to each other. That's the whole problem with Tohu. In Tikkun, that's repaired. So both dimensions of Iskalus, which, as we just said, break down to 4 types of dysfunctionality, exist in Tohu. So now he's going to apply these 4 to how it is there in Tohu. The Masha'anu Maitzin, the Eid is the Tohu, what we find in the energies of Tohu, Shayb Madregel Yenim Eid is the Tikkun, which are on a higher level than the energies of Tikkun, v'nikra eris tekifim v'chazakim. And they're called, the energies of Tohu are called intense and strong energies. They're very intense, tekif v'chazak, and strong. They're untempered. So you can imagine, they're like, they are dangerous. They're powerful. Because they come from the very high gvuris, very high dimensions of severity, of intensity. That's their root. What does this mean that they're such powerful energies? It means that being remember, is Ayin, bittul. It means that they have in them ultimate bittul betachlis, the ultimate bittul, the ultimate intensity to be encompassed and submerged in their root, in their source, in the source of their emanation, with ultimate intensity. So if you say a regular oir, its nature is to transcend, its nature is to return, to be encompassed and engulfed and submerged in its source. So intense energy has this desire, has this personality in an intense way. So like when we say Nadav and Avihu went into the Mishkan, Orach Chaim explains what happened. It was their intensity that destroyed them, not their weakness, not that they were passive. They were so excited, so ecstatic. The first day the temple was stood up, was erected. They were so excited, they ran in unprepared, and they got burned by the fire. This is Klais HaNefesh, where the excitement, the intensity is too much for the containers to contain. So the ayin works against them. The oirs are too much ayin, basically, is what he's saying. But the problem is that this bittul itself is murgash. It's theirs. They own it. They strongly feel it. It's not coming from setting themselves aside from bittul. So in other words, there's 2 types of bittul. There's a bittul that I want, and there's a bittul that I do what God wants. Here, the air obviously loses its real personality, because real air would do exactly what God wants. But the air takes itself very seriously and has now become consumed with itself, consumed with its desire to enter into the source, which of course is ironic, because the source wants it to remain where it is. But that's one of the flaws and dysfunctionalities when air is too intense. Okay? So the weakness is not that it doesn't want, it wants too much. But it's murgish. We discussed this much earlier when we talked about Tohu, that there's bittul there, but the bittul of the air, there's also air there. So it's ayin, but it's ayin that's murgish. It's like, I want it. It's it's spiritual arrogance, basically. It's an intensity, not by putting themselves aside and doing what is correct. And we can say, according to what we explained earlier in chapter 236, the yesh lemer, what was explained there? The yesh lemer, that we can say that it is the Tohu, that the energies of Tohu, and let's just review. Remember, Tohu is the world of chaos, the world that precedes Tikkun. It's a world with a market correction, so to speak, where there's an imbalance between Eretz and Kelim before they find balance in the world of Tikkun. That's just in the cosmic map, that's the role of Tohu. So yesh limit, we could say, according to what we said earlier, that we can say that was also a chiddush back in Reish Lamed Vav, that the energies of Torah loy hayu b'chinas dveikus b'mekayim. They were not cleaved to their source. It's an interesting thing here, in other words. Everything he discussed about air is ayin, that it cleaves to the source. But Tohu, everything, there's a distortion in every level, even air. What is the distortion? Loy hayu b'chinas dveikus b'mekayim. The kashem shasfiras hayu b'chinas anfim mispadim zemezeh. Just as the spheres, in other words, there's a few problems in Tohu. Just as the spheres, each sphere, are separate branches, because remember, there's no escalas there, on the second level as well, on the kelim, they don't work together. So just like they're separate branches, chachma is chachma, bina is bina, chesed doesn't have gvura within it, gvura doesn't have chesed within it. Each one is a separate identity. Same is true that they're also separate from their source. In other words, what's happened here, if you make a science fiction film, it'd be like this. The source has emanated energy, but because the energy is intense and not balanced, remember after the tzimtzum, there's an imbalance going on, so the energy is not balanced properly. So that energy someplace becomes a loose cannon, a radical agent. It's still energy, it's still air, it's not containers, but it's lost the touch of the kavanah el-yena. It's lost touch of what the higher purpose was, which is, if you recall, in Tikkun, the air mitzad atzmai is already weaker and has within it a sense that it has to enter into the container. And then the container adds to the kavanah el-yena that we joined completely, etc., etc. So there too in Tikkun, there's also a dominance of the feature of ayin, of the feature that remains outside of the container, transcendence. But remember, when I speak, let's say, the children of Aaron, it's different than when you and I have transcendence, our soul senses that it wants to reach up and has to be forced to come into the body. That's not an overdose of spirituality that burns up the body. That's just that we have restlessness. That in a normal situation, even when you're in this material world, you sense there's something greater, something transcendent. That's coming from the soul and the air that still retains its air personality. But it's not. But it's a healthy balance there. But imagine the air is too much. Like, for example, you have people on Nafshi Choshke B'Teir, Ben Azai. He never married. He wanted to learn Torah all the time. Someone that's too spiritually alive, too spiritually on fire, that is not the kavanah. So the spirituality, it's not coming from grubkeit. It's not coming from someone who's just become materialistic and just not interested in God at all. Too much interested. So air there's that flaw that air has. And I could say, how could air have such a flaw? If air is always dovik to the one me'in hamoyer, where did it get such a problem? Air is nothing more but its source. How suddenly did it assume this type of its own agenda, which is to connect to the source, but not according to the kavanah? Like, as God is saying, you go out and work, meraglim. God says, go to the promised land. No, we want to stay here and learn Torah. How does air have that bchira, so to speak, that free will? Keli, you could say, the container never is initially created in a way that it's separate from the source. So you could say a container can make a mistake. But air is, the answer you have to say is because of the tzimtzum. Air in Sof Lifnei tzimtzum is impossible for that to happen, because their air is pure, seamless expression of the divine will. But the tzimtzum, remember, did something that forever, so to speak, leaves a wound in the air, a wound. It's all for the good, but the tzimtzum concealed the entire air. And then the kav was sent into the dark black hole to begin to illuminate, to create. But the tzimtzum had an impact on the air, because if it didn't, it wouldn't have. The whole purpose of the tzimtzum is complete concealment, to allow for the kalim to emerge. So the airs are now have a bug inside of them. So something happened in the concealment. And Tohu is where that bug manifests. I mean, I'll give you my explanation for this. That's not what he says here. And maybe there are other explanations. So that bug is that the air has lost somewhat of its direction. Not in all levels, but somewhere. And Tohu is where it becomes full-blown. Because the air is saying, do I belong here? There's a tzimtzum. Maybe I belong back before the tzimtzum. So there's an imbalance, and that's why there's the market correction. So the intensity of the air is suddenly become, as I said, a radical agent, a loose cannon, so to speak. I mean, in the sense that just like the containers in Tohu, the spheres, are separate from one another, also the air has lost a period from its source. And therefore, yes, it's still Ayin. The air is still looking for God, but it's looking for it on its own terms. I think that's a really good way to explain it. And that's why they don't have at all them the hergish of the kavon elyena. In other words, they don't have the sense of what the higher purpose is. So think of it like this: air has two elements to it. One is ayin, and that Tohu and Tikkun are similar. All air is similar. Air is not yesh; it's ayin. Its personality is to be submerged in its source, not its own agenda. But then there's another thing that air has. It's a bittul to the kavon elyena, or it's a bittul to its own bittul, so to speak. So if it's bittul to the kavon elyena, that's in Tikkun, where it senses the higher purpose that I have to go down. In Tohu, the second element of air, the ayin is there, but it's now become bittul to its own bittul. In other words, it's more important that it be submerged than what the source, and it doesn't hear the source saying, you don't belong here right now. You belong al karcha chatachai. I'm telling you to go down. And that's why they don't have the bittul of putting themselves aside, which comes from the feeling of atzmus. So they have the ayin element of air, but they don't have the hanochas atzmusay. So this is what's called a bittul that's b'murgish. It senses its own bittul. It's like bottled to its bittul, whereas instead of being bottled to its source. Well, commotion is born leil perek reishadidal, shezel mitzad kavonis neitzis ha'aschala. Like we explained in chapter 294, when we talked about how the containers affect the air by giving it that sense of the higher purpose, that this comes from the kavanah, the purpose that is wedged. The beginning is wedged. Kavonis neitzis ha'aschala. The kavanah as it is, as the beginning is wedged, which is wedged later in the end, in the containers. And in Tohu, where they don't have that sense of the higher purpose, therefore, it's inevitable or it's natural. Consequentially, they don't have the bittul, that bittul, that above bittul that we mentioned. They don't have the bittul of the kavon elyena that is supposed to go down, manifest in the containers, and they also don't have the bittul of kula kamei kala chashuv, like the Eris of Tikkun have, the sense that there's nothing but God. Because that too comes from the source. So he's adding two things they're missing when they don't sense the source. One, they're missing the kavanah of the source, which is to go into the containers. And two, they're missing even a simpler thing that air has. Just the sense that nothing but God. Everything is bottled, even you. They've become so-called, it's like yesh in ayin. It's an ayin that's become a yesh, so to speak. What do they have? Rather, they have the scholars, the submergence in their source, which is very much sensed, murgish. It's very much, what's the word for it? They're very not conscious, murgish. Like what I said to the children of Aaron. They're not more than murgish is regish, is a feeling. It's very much sensed. They very much sense their ecstasy to the point that it's too much. They're saying, instead of the bittul, you feel their ecstasy, you feel their intensity. The intensity is more powerful than the kavanah, obviously, which is their undoing. And that's because they are, at the end of the day, they are air. Because they're not yesh, which wants to go down. They are, at the end of the day, they are a component, they are energy. And that's why they have the rotze, the desire, the yearning to be submerged and to be encompassed into in their source. But what they don't have is the hanocha, to put themselves aside, and the bittul atzma, and to be mevatel, to sublimate themselves. Because ki'im, it's only in a form of, because ki'im, by them, it's not that way, it's b'chinas murgish. It's very much sensed. So they're very much filled with their own intensity, as opposed to the humility required to just put yourself aside. Had another view, so-called tempered their intensity, and would have said, "Oh, we're here to see God," humility, they would have been able to contain it. The problem is their own intensity, they ran too fast, so they got burned by it. Just using it as an example. So we have the two elements. So it's oir, clearly oir, but it's an oir that is a misfired type of oir. It's a dysfunctional oir, essentially. So we can't say this is the natural tendency of oir. Like I said, natural oir is lifnei tzimtzum. And tikkun has it because you have to diminish this intensity before you can get back to this intensity.
This is like the oil that was too much of a real.
We didn't. He's going to say. You don't have to guess. Okay. Thank God the Rebbe Rashab continues to write. There's no. We'll get there. He's behema, and this is why Tohu is called behema. Remember, ban. Tohu is ban, which is gematria behema, 52, and tikkun is ma, gematria adam. Behema, what's behema? Ba ma. Behema is the words ba, ma. Within it you have ma, which is bittul, as we discussed at length. Shoyu behem b'chinas ma, ba'ayin. They have in them ma. Ma is whatness, what. They have in them ma, or ma. The aim b'chinas is kalas v'hei b'teikav b'yeser. But the ma is ba, is within them. It's not encompassed in the source properly, and it's very intense, like a behemoth. It's powerful. No, my mistake. No. Didn't read it right. They have the element of ma and ayin, bittul, that they are encompassed. Correct what I just said. And it was there very intense. And you can explain. Ru'uma is none of the names in the Torah of Esav's wives, I believe. So Ru'uma, the Baal Shem Tov interprets, and Chassidus explains, Ru'uma is also made of two words. Ru'uma. See, watch. Bittul hu b'murgish. That there you have bittul, but the bittul is sensed, and that's the problem. So Ru'uma, look. Someone who goes around and saying, "Look how bittul I am." Look who thinks he's nobody. That type of thing. Ru'uma, look how ma I am. So there's bittul, but the bittul is very much an arrogant bittul, in a sense. Murgish, very much sensed. And in Tohu, the sense is very intense. The level of Malchus in each of the spheres of Tohu, b'chinas yesh, the keli, b'chinas yeshu, b'chinas amlucha, b'chinas ba. The Ruma may have been one of the kings of Tohu. Maybe that's what it is. I have to look it up. Anyway, yeah, that's probably what it is. That's why he's saying Malchus here. So the Malchus of every sphere, every sphere has Malchus within it, which is the lowest level. Shahu b'chinas hayesh, the kli, b'chinas yeshu, shu b'chinas hamalucha, b'chinas ba. So it's a form of mulucha, of leadership, but it's a level of yesh, the level of ban. V'lo hoye bo b'chinas bittul hayesh la'ayin kol kach lifi erech gedel ayin de'er shei b'chinas ayin yesh medai. And they didn't have in them the bittul hayesh, the ayin, the containers now we're talking about of tohu, of the container. That is commensurate to the intensity of the ayin de'er, which was also too much ayin. So in other words, the containers don't have enough bittul, and it's commensurate to the air, and the air is also too intense. And that's because the ayin and bittul of tohu is very much sensed without putting themselves aside. That's why also their malchus, their containers are also very much of a yesh. I mean, he's now elaborating a little more. So first he started by saying that the air is too intense, too much of itself. So it's too much ayin in a way. And that now he's saying causes that also the containers should be too much yesh. So basically because the air is not interested in the container. So the container is now also a loose agent, without anyone to train it, without anyone to sublimate it. So the containers of tohu become also this level of too much yesh. And it all rooted here because the air is not sensing its kavanah eliyana, the source, and does not lay itself aside for that purpose. V'yashlemer, the b'chinas hamalchus u'b'chinas hayirida v'hamshacha shalahem, and we could say that the malchus within the levels of tohu refers to the level of yirida v'hamshacha shalahem, how they descend and how they manifest and are transmit and are drawn downward. Commotion is bar leil pedek leish tes, and we discussed earlier in chapter 249. The mitzada eres haye b'chinas hamshachas, the mitzada eres haye b'chinas hamshach rak shei b'chinas yeshus da no emlech. That from the perspective of the energies, there was hamshacha. They did extend, they did transmit, but it was the transmission of yeshus da no emlech. This goes back to that earlier discussion, that I am leading, ano emlech. So it's yes, the yesh is saying, the air is saying, I'm here, I'm dominating, but it's me, I'm here. So it's like arrogant leadership, essentially. So it's intensity. Or you could say a different way you can interpret it. I'll explain in a minute. Or you can say that the malchus is referring to the kelim, not to the descent of the air, of the energy, but as the container, actual container, yesh gomer. That was a complete yesh. That there's no measuring, there's no tempering, not in the energy and not in the container, and it's interdependent. I know it's somewhat like he suddenly went from one thing to the next. So let me just to sum it up. It's pretty clear. What he's saying is obviously starting with energy. The energy of tohu are very intense, but it's a form of, it's ayin. It wants to be the source, but it's about itself. It's not about the kavanah eliyana. It doesn't have able to put itself aside. So it retains the ayin element, but the ayin is a distorted, it's thwarted. The ayin is now doing what it wants, and now it wants to be in the divine, so it doesn't consider others. This in turn causes that the yesh, the containers of tohu, are now also on their own, so to speak, and they remain more yesh than necessary. And then he explains that this is all, remember that in tohu we call them the kings of tohu. The end of Parsha Vayishlach, that's where tohu is described, is that the 7 kings of, these are the kings, the family of scions of Esav. I think maybe that's where Umah is, one of those kings. So these are the kings that it says, Vayimlech Vayamas. They ruled and they died. So Kabbalah, so this explains, this is Shviras HaKelim. We're talking about the king. Why kings? Because because you call the spheres of Tohu are kingly ones. They're powerful ones. They're kings. They're not peasants. They're not weak. But that's also their undoing, because they're not balanced. So they die. They break. There's two reasons they break, as we discussed. One, it's the eris. The eris don't tolerate each other. The second, the containers don't give and take. So the eris of Tohu, the kings of Tohu, so to speak, are in this type of intensity. So now, in this last piece here, it's discussing, so what is Malchus? The Malchus, when you say kingship. Is it the element, is it so-called the Keli Shebe'er, which means that Malchus refers to coarseness, and we can say yesh, like he says in the previous chapter, that Malchus refers to the Yerida, the being drawn down, ruling, but in a form of yeshus. I am ruling, I'm the king, which is also its undoing and will be destroyed. Or does Malchus refer to the actual container, the recipient, that the energy is supposed to be giving to? And the recipient is too much of a yesh. So in other words, both and Keli are behaving like a yesh. But yeshus is, I intensely want to go into the source. Right. Or too much self-sense of bittul. It's full of itself. Or Malchus is referring to the actual Keli, it's yesh. But the bottom line is that both of them are not properly tempered and measured. The formula is not there. Not in the energy, not in the container, and it's interdependent. Meaning, one is affected by because if the air was proper, the container would be more receptive. So this would be the equivalent, using the example, imagine a teacher coming to a class, brilliant teacher, too brilliant. He starts teaching, he's so consumed with himself. He's there to teach. He's come to be read the Vamshacha. That's all about him. He's teaching and teaching, and obviously he overwhelms or the students he doesn't really care about us. So they go off doing what they have to do. They're not receptive to him. So he's transmitting, he's pontificating, and transmitting energy. As opposed to a person that say doesn't even come into the classroom, is not a teacher at all. That's not an air. Air is a force. Another person could say, I'm not going to teach at all. That would be an example of someone who the air is just not showing up. But that's not. But we're talking about someone who does show up. The air has a function, but its function has been hijacked by its own distorted sense. Like in Rotzi V'shuv is the classic term used in the book of Yecheskel, where it says Achayis Rotzi V'shuv. Rotzi means to run, shuv to return. Like an energy. I see an energy, like a lightning bolt. Run and return. It requires every form of energy requires a positive and a negative. Contraction, expansion. The heart. Exhale, inhale. Rotzi V'shuv. Tension, resolution. So you yearn, in a healthy balance of Rotzi V'shuv, you yearn, you have a healthy sense of angst, you want more, and then you return, you bring it down. In an unhealthy, you either run too far, you yearn too much, to the point you become completely either expire through that, or you yearn too little, and there's too much keli. So a good Rotzi V'shuv is a balance. You're going and returning. Proper, like a heartbeat. It looks like this, the wave. It has to look like that, like a perfect wave. So when the yearning is in a true bittul, then the return, the resolution will also be bittul, in a form of bittul. Like when one fulfills Torah and mitzvahs, to fulfill the will of the above, the divine will, the supernal will. He's doing it not, it means not in order to cleave, his soul should cleave, and to radiate, illuminate his soul with the divine light, with the divine energy. His entire kavanah, his entire purpose, his entire intention is only to fulfill God's will. Not to fulfill, I want it, I'm hungry, I want to satisfy, I want my soul to be filled with His light. Well, and even a higher level of Aveda is Shekavrasu Lasis Lamata Kli Lelikus. This is that he's doing Torah mitzvahs not for himself, but for the only to fulfill God's will. The higher level is that his kavanah is to go down and create a container of the world, in the material world, for divine, for Elokus. In order to unite God and the Shechina, which is like Zohar and Malchus. Then we say before we say a mitzvah. We don't say it before every mitzvah. We say it in the morning. So extends, it says this for all the entire day. But we're saying that our purpose of doing all these mitzvahs is in order to unite with the lower world. In order to fulfill the higher purpose, the divine purpose of existence, that there should be a home in the lowest of worlds, a divine home. So not just doing it to fulfill God's will, he's doing it to fulfill. He's going down to actually make the world a container to the divine, and thereby fulfilling God's desire to have a home in this material world. Like he says in Tanya, end of chapter 10, that he does it not to satiate his hungry soul, his thirsty soul, rather. He's doing it only to unite. He's doing it for God. In other words, the purpose is not to satiate his own thirsty soul, but to unite the divine with the world. By creating a dir b'tachtein. V'gam afilu b'kavonos hamitzvos, and also even when we do the intentions that we have in our mitzvahs, b'shvil l'davik nafshi b'elokuz, l'hamshich b'nafshi, and even when we do have the kavanah, in order to l'davik nafshi, to connect ourselves, to cleave in godliness, and to draw into our soul's energy, the divine energy, even that, he's going to be back. Even when you do it for that purpose, the reason you're doing it is because of the truth of it. Because that itself is the purpose. That you have to be clear, you should cleave to God. In other words, it's not for selfish purposes. So number one is doing it for the divine purpose, not for satisfying your hunger or thirst. Number two, even when you do it to satisfy hunger and thirst, because that too is the kavanah, that your soul should be connected. And also that it should radiate into the soul. But the aim is murgish kol kach. But it's not murgish kol kach. You're not sensing me, you're sensing that's what God wants. He wants me to be connected. So it's not me to connect, it's God wants, just like he wants dir b'tachtenim, he also wants that I should have a connection with him. So the focus and emphasis is on the connection, even when you're doing it with that element in mind. It's not because of self-love. And not like in blita means, blita means when somebody pops his head up. Blita means someone's like, I'm here, A blita, when someone does something with blita, it's with, what's the word for it? Like pompous, with making sure everybody knows that he's doing it. Instead of doing it quietly and humbly, blita means to do something with too much, like somebody getting up and saying, "I'm here." How would you say that in English? There's a word for it. There's too much, not exposure, too haughty, too much you there. There's too much. There's a word for it. I'll get to it. This is rotze that's in the proper bittul. A rotze proper bittul. What did he say? Basically, that it's not that when the rotze is proper, the shuv will be appropriate. Also, in a form of bittul. What's a proper rotze? That when you are yearning to connect to God, it's not because me. I love myself, and here I am. I'm the one that's look at me. I'm the big bittul one. But it's because of the higher purpose. And even the part where you get satisfied, and the soul gets satisfied, its thirst and radiates the divine radiance, and that's also, because that's the kavanah, that's the main purpose, because that also is the purpose, the divine purpose. Not because of me, but because of the divine. So that would be like somebody So you get a shlichus, let's say, from the Rebbe to go somewhere. It's not your nature. Like the Alter Rebbe story, to become a balagola, become a taxi driver of those times. So it's not what he wanted. He was a scholar. But he does it. That's a very strong proof that he's not doing it for himself. He's doing it because that's what the kavanah is. Even if it's in. Now, what about when he's sitting and learning with his Rebbe? So you could also say, well, now it's about me. No. But even a person with bittul, proper bittul, even when they're satisfied, there's a certain humility there. It's not about me, and hey, I want to understand, and I'm the big guy here. They sit with humility, the same humility that they had when they became a balagola. So the bittul also extends even when you're doing things that do so-called sate and feed and nourish your soul. But now he's going to talk the opposite. When the rotze, the yearning, is not a true bittul, then the shuv also will be a very strong yesh, a very strong itness, very, very coarse. Because this is only self-love. He wants the energy, he wants the light and the revelation for himself because it's good for him. And look at what we learned earlier in the above chapter. About the containers that they're just for themselves. So since the air is doing it for himself, so the container also is now only into itself. Pericanal would be pericanal, is it? Is it no. Okay. An example for this we'll understand in Tohu. Because now remember, he's going back to Tohu. All this was an example of Rotzi and Shuv. Well, all this we'll understand in Tohu. Because the energy was in a submergence in its source. With a very, as Gabi used to say, with an overabundant intensity, not with true bittul. That's why also the containers are very strong yesh, are intense yesh. He's adding something in the parentheses. And look, Ayin, study what it says in Eitz Chaim, Shar Nekudim. Nekudim, remember, is another name for Tohu. There's Akudim, Nekudim, Verudim, the three types of sheep. So Akudim is 10 energies in one container. Nekudim is dots. It's 10 energies in 10 containers, but they don't have symbiosis. They don't have interconnectivity, scholars. So Shar Nekudim and Eitz Chaim from the Arizal, Perik Dalet, chapter 4, Shabatohu Yotzu Akelim Tchilav Achakacha Eris. Then Tohu, the containers emerged first, and afterwards the energies. The Chemavur become Mekamis, and the same is explained in different places. Shakelim himshichu kafimu husam. That the containers drew down energy according to their personalities, the Kalim's personalities. Haina bechinas klali, which means a general type of air. He's just qualifying, in the parentheses. Here it seems that the air is affecting the keli. Who's the culprit? So it seems that we're discussing the air is not proper. It's not true bittul. It doesn't have anochas atzmusa. It's only into itself. So that's also causing the keli to be the shuv and the keli to be too coarse. So he's qualifying and saying in Eitz Chaim it says seemingly the opposite, that the containers are the one that affect the air. The containers came first. So he says, but in answering, reconciling it, he said, nevertheless, even if the containers emerged first, their creation, their formation, was through energy, through the ait. And that's through the istaklus of einayim. That's through the eyes. Remember, we learned this earlier about the forehead in Ak. Obviously, this is all a mashal, a metaphor. So in Ak, in the supernal man, in the primordial man, rather, you have Adam Kadmon, you have the imagery of you have the ears, you have the oizen chaytim peh, the ears, the nose, and the mouth. Talked about that regarding Tohu and regarding in Tikkun, where the Metzach, the forehead, is the Shem Ma, and that's Shem Sag. There's going to tell you in Tikkun, the root of it all. That Shem Ma is the root of the bittul. So what he says there in that Eitz Chaim is that there's also the eyes. The eyes, which is Shem Ab, that's what creates the kalim in the kalim of Tohu. So in other words, it's not a contradiction. Even if you say the kalim emerged first, but nevertheless the kalim were created through the energy, and that's through Staklas Anayim. We're not going into the Kabbalah of it. The bottom line is that the Anayim caused the airs to create the containers. And afterwards, what manifests in the containers is the Eir Einayim, the light of the eyes, which is that's the primary element of Eir. And look at the commentary there, Yafar Shah, the third Eifin Gimel, the third piece. Okay, this needs to be looked at more Kabbalistically. The bottom line is, he's just qualifying in the parentheses because it's very thorough, Ayin Beis, that at the end of the day, the Eiris define the Kalim, not the Kalim define the Eiris, even if the Kalim emerge first. Obviously, I didn't explain it because I need to look into myself to understand this parenthesis properly. We'll move on. I'll go back to it when I look into it with Eitz Chaim. Okay, so the eyes looked into the iris of the ear, nose, mouth, and then manifests into them. And as a result, since the air was too intense into itself, the keli is too much of a yesh, and therefore the keli cannot contain the energy at all. Because it doesn't have enough bittul to receive the energy, the light, the revelation of the level of ayin that much. It doesn't say completely not, but it doesn't have enough bittul to contain it.
It seems to be not to permit it
So how does that, what?
It seems to be not to permit it to contain any oil.
It doesn't say that. It says kol kach, not that much.
The bittul, but it says a clean measure or kam.
Right. Yeah, that cannot contain the air, but the bittul, it still has bittul, but it's not enough to receive the air and ayin that much. Now he's going back to explain which of the four ways this is. The example for this is like the example of the wick that does not get consumed by the fire. The fire expires from it. The fire disappears from it. This looks like the first of the four. The first of the four, we're talking about the keli right now. Anyway, I don't want to assume maybe he's going to probably spell it out. Let's continue, and we'll see. He's just beginning to use that example again. From the example is the first level of the example. The wick is not a wick, so it doesn't get burned. It's not able to ignite. And this is the cause for the breaking of the containers in Tohu. Because the container did not have that much bittul to the ayin. Which is commensurate to the ayin of the air, which is also a problem, which transcends and is encompassed with an extra amount, with overabundant intensity. So it's interesting. What he's saying is two things. The ayin is a problem, and that causes the keli is a problem. But now there's another thing. Because the ayin is so intense in its own thing, the container cannot have bittul to that. It doesn't relate to it. Because the ayin is not like the teacher that's just pontificating about himself. So what happens here is that not only what he said earlier that the ayin is not commensurate to the air in general, here the air is even more intense, so the disparity is even greater. The dissonance is greater. So if hypothetically the ayin of Tohu was all right, and the keli is too much of a yesh, okay, or the keli is not bottle to the ayin. Like let's say it's a wick that that's not receptive. But here the ayin is even more intense. So the disparity is a greater one. Hypothetically, if the keli had that type of profound bittul, even more than regular, it could be a keli, and it couldn't be because the air itself is into itself. So the keli, there's no way. It's like, what would happen to the students, to this arrogant teacher? They start saying, please. If they belittle themselves and they have total ayin, they're not going to receive more. The problem is the whole thing is dysfunctional. So that's the bottom line. So that's what causes the shviras hakelim, because the container doesn't have that much bittul to the ayin. The fierech, commensurate to how much the ayin to the way the bittul of the ayin is elevating there. V'zeu madrega ha'alef legriusa, and this is the first possibility, the first level, negative dysfunctional level. Sha'eru that we discussed. So it is the first level. Sha'eru b'chinas ayin beis. Okay, the energy is too much ayin. V'akeli b'chinas yesh beis, and the container is too much yesh. U'b'madrega ha'beis, and the second level, hu b'ktsei ha'beis mitzad ha'keli. The second level discussed is the other extreme from the perspective, the other extreme from the perspective of the container. And that is the opposite. The container is the ultimate bittul yesh, more than necessary. More than what's necessary. And even I'm not sure what kamaya is, but tachas bitla yesh yesem midai. That's ultimate bitla yesh. So as we said, the wick is completely porous, or very porous. So it's more than necessary. Meaning that I guess it's like the energy, or is it too much bit like the energy is too much bittul? No, probably it becomes like air. It's too porous. It's almost too similar to the air. It's lost itself. So and more than proportionate to how the ayin of the air is. So it's like it went too much ayin. The nichlal mamish ba'er, and it completely gets consumed and submerged into the air, to the energy. Sezeu gamkin bilti miskayim. That also is not sustainable. And what is this level? He says, "V'hein neshamas hagvoyish mebchinas ban she'ol l'maylim mebchinas hakelim dafka." This refers to the high neshamas, those very exalted souls that come from the level of ban, that went up, that died. In other words, that didn't die, that rose, that left this world with their containers, like who? Chanoch and Eliyahu. She'olu begufim l'mayla. It talks about Chanoch and Parsha Bereshis and Eliyahu, that both of them did not physically die. They, with their bodies, they went up into the higher worlds. Ukidua, the neshama is the ban, as it's known that the neshama souls of the world of ban, there's neshama is the ban, there's neshama is the man. The souls of ban, avedasm b'chinas chemer gufam dafka. Their work, their efforts are specifically with their bodies, with the chemer, with the substance of their bodies. The neshamas elu gam kamosheim beibur bebeten the nukva. These souls, even the way they are in pregnancy, in the embryonic stage of nukva, in the malchus, gam kene ikeru bezichlich levushe hanefesh. There too, their primary role is to refine the levushi, the garments of the nefesh. In other words, that's ban. So the kalim, more like the kalim. Like Eliyahu, who was a pregnancy of 12 months. That was in order to be able to take more time to refine the chumris. So these neshamas are very much involved with the kalim. That's why they leave the world with their kalim. He's soon going to get back to what it is trying to say here. The Moshe is the opposite. He's a neshama of ma. He was in pregnancy only 7 months. Because his primary focus is on tikkun of the neshama, of elevating the soul. And for that, it's enough 7 months. No, with less time with the body, because what the body is developing, the soul is there before. So the development of pregnancy is for the body to develop more. And by Eliyahu, it was in order to repair the chumri, the substance, or more than substance, the coarseness. This is referring to the repair of the container. For this, you need to have 12 months. Like explains in Eitz Chaim, shad anach. Eris Netzutzas Kalim. That's anach. It's a comment. It's a acronym. V'neshamas elu, and these souls from ban that repair the containers, gamba b'yem leguf, even when they come into a body, ikar avidasum bittul v'chumris. Their main thing is the bittul of the chumris. So even when they come in a body, their focus and main work is the sublimation of the chumris. How would we translate chumris? It's more than just gashmis. Gashmis is physical. Chumris is coarse physical. It's more coarse than the physical. The yesh only this is what we need to have our Hasidicpedia, where people will contribute translations and explanations of these words. So chumris is a good one to figure out exactly how we define it. Grubkat. To translate grubkat. And they have, in truth, a sublimation in their coarseness of their bodies more than in their souls. And this sublimation of the chumram, of their physical coarseness, is not coming from the soul. bittul. In other words, it's not the focus here that the soul is causing the sublimation of the chemer, of the coarseness. It's not that. It's that they are bittul ba'atzmam. They themselves are bittul in the essential personality of their chemer, of their coarseness. Like David HaMelech, that even the physical body of his, he was completely bittul. He had a broken and downtrodden and soul, heart. And like he says in Timothy, I am a pauper. I'm a poor man, impoverished. Oni ve'evian, both poor and even more poor. Evian is even poorer than Oni. And I'm like a worm. He's just bringing many verses that explain how David HaMelech refers to himself, completely, even on his physical level, as nothing, as bottle. If I'm not, Shavisi is, Shavisi Hashem, it means that I'm balanced, I'm equalized. I'm flattened, you can say. The demamti, and I'm silenced. Not only in his neshama, in his body he was bittul b'tachlis. So he said, "Leiv nishba v'nitra," a broken heart, is referring not to a soul, it's talking to the body, on a bodily level. Obviously, we mean here not just broken physical body is broken. It means the bodiliness, the physicality. So Moshe's focus is elevating the soul. The focus of Eliyahu and Chanoch, neshama is the ban. He's using now David HaMelech as an example. not necessarily as a neshama of ban, but the idea, their focus is the birur of the refinement of the chaymer, of the material, of the container, and not the neshama affecting the container, but the container itself sensing its worthlessness. Like we see in many people, we see that they have fundamentally a bittul hayesh, a sense of humility on the yesh level. For them it's very easy, or it's very, not for them, it's very easy to break their hearts. To break their coarse hearts. And that they should, this battle means they should be, should nullify their gasus. Gasus is another word for grobkeit, for their thickness. And without any particular understanding or contemplation or love and awe of the mind, intellectual love and awe, these people, just from a natural love and awe that they have, with very little, with little contemplation and meditation, their hearts get broken, and their gasus, their coarseness, their what did I say? Gasus was nullify their thickness. Why some people get broken easily like that is because they have fundamental bittul inherently in their physical bodies, in their coarse bodies. The kamoshe and the mile of ibur. This is going back to the neshamas of ban, just as they are above in the level of ibur when they were in pregnancy. Ha'ikru bittul chumram. The main focus is on the bittul of the sublimation of their coarseness. The same when they come down below, these souls of ban, their primary work is in the achna, in the sublimation, in the taming, in the achna. When you say achna, someone is differential, more than differential. Achna. In the diminishing, in the belittling, when someone's subduing or submissive, subduing and submitting, subduing their chaymer. Okay. And they have, because of their root of neshamas bam, they have the power to humble the chaymer guf from the coarseness of their body, easier, because of that source. Easily, rather. And they have the ability to humble the coarseness of this easily because of their source. And by Eliyahu and Chanech, this bittul was on a very high level, to the point that their bodies actually elevated above, because what dominated, what overpowered in their containers of their bodies, because what overpowered the container of their bodies was the bittul of the divine bittul to a state of Ayin Beis. The container became like Ayin. Even though all this is about ban the tikkun, this is an appropriate ban. Remember, he's going now to the second level of the dysfunctionality, but he's explaining with a positive example how it's proper. Because the Chanoch and Eliyahu actually was holy. There's no problem with that. So even though this is ban the tikkun, like it says elsewhere, Eliyahu is the level of ban of ma is tikkun, ban is tohu. Still, this is not the level of tikkun, not ma of ma. It's not actual tikkun. Because the tikkun, you actually have a balanced ayin v'yesh, a balanced bittul, a balanced ayin selflessness, substanceless, and yesh and itness, the midah mishkal, properly measured and weighed. And in a way where there's a yashvus, where it settles in the container, and in a way that there is shiyah, that it should have within it a revelation, a manifestation of the energy of the divine energy and a revelation. The Khan by Eliyahu and Chanoch, the neshamas of Ban, harihoya b'chinas aliyah v'istalkus. They did not remain down here below. They all went up because of the containers that were too much bittul. He's giving an example. I don't know if he's saying that it's inappropriate what happened with Chanoch and Eliyahu, but it's definitely not the kavan el. So for them, what happened is the opposite. He's giving the opposite is what happened. The first level of this first level of dysfunctionality, the griyusa, is that the keli is completely not a container. The ayin is too much ayin; it's into itself, and the container is into itself. Here, the container is being consumed by the flame. So that's why he went through the whole thing. He had to explain it's a container thing. It's not the air forced itself on the container. They were so consumed, and their job is so much the tikkun of the container, refinement of the container, that the container itself, in the most intense level, went up together with the air. So it's an example of the second level, which is not mamish tikkun. So he's explaining it's not this, but it's still not the ultimate purpose, because the ultimate purpose of the neshama is begufin down here, and here the keli became like the air. So it says, and an example that he gave was those people whose hearts break easily, etc. That means that it's easy to break their keli. So the keli gets consumed too quickly, too powerfully by the energy. Let's do the kitzur, and then we'll conclude. You've been explaining all these four levels of dysfunctionality in Tohu. In Tohu, the energy is an intense yearning, an intense desire to be encompassed in Atzmos, in the source. Behema boma. It's like a behema, which is the words boma. But it was too much, very, 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 very conscious of it, very much felt, sensed. In other words, it senses its presence, its own presence. And the container was too much yesh. And they're interdependent. Like by Rotzi and Shuv, yearning and returning. When the Rotzi is with the appropriate bittul, the Shuv, the return will also be appropriate bittul. Like Rabbi Akiva, Nichnus b'shalom, v'yotze b'shalom. He went in with bittul, the Rotzi, so his Shuv was with bittul. The others didn't go in properly. They went in with too much intensity and they didn't come out properly. One went crazy, one went mad, one died, and one became an apostate. When you do the mitzvahs not for your own desire, to fulfill your own desire, but to unite kutchabrich v'shchinta b'tachtenim in the lower worlds. And also when you cleave to him, and you want to draw down energy into your soul, it's also because that's the will, higher will, not because you want it. Is the primary sense, but it's because it's the higher will. And in Tohu, because the yearning was so sensed by it, and that's why also the container is overabundant yesh, and they don't unite, and they didn't unite. This is the cause for the breakage. That the energies expired, and the containers fell below, and separated. That's the first level. And the second level, so what do you have there? That the containers are too much yesh, so they're not containers of energy, and that's where they break apart. So you have the wick and the fire don't meet, and they actually separate. They break apart. And the containers go down and separate. The second level, the opposite extreme in the container. That the container is too much bittul. Instead of overabundant not bittul, overabundant yesh, it's now too much sublimation. He's adding now something they didn't say in the inside. And the levels of Tohu, you can say Shazayin Va'ara is batilis. That like its land gets annihilated. There's an example for this in the ban of tikkun is like the souls of Chanoch and Eliyahu. The neshama is the ban in the bittul chumna mitzvah. Souls of ban, their main work, their primary work is the sublimation of the coarseness on its own. And it was so sublimated till they went up above with their bodies. The primary thing of tikkun is the opposite: containment, shashvus, integration, internalization in the container. So we shall stop here. We did chapter 297, pages 600 through 602.